Hey, hi everyone. Welcome to our second episode of our podcast Web3 and Chill. Again, we are joined with two amazing guests, Peter and Hari. Both of them have had an amazing careers in, I would say, not the Web2 world, but one is managing partner, the other is a chief strategy officer, but they still are getting their hands dirty in the Web3 world or the NFT space. So let's find out why, how. Hi, guys. How are you?
Very
Hey,
good.
both. Good. Thank you for having us.
So, you guys have had a stellar careers. Uh, why did you launch your own NFT collection?
Wow. So that's a great question. So, hey, everybody, my name is Peter Evans. And, I guess I'm an explorer, at heart. So as new opportunities emerge with new technologies, you take a look. And that led to more exploration because there's a lot there to discover. So we can get into the details of that, but let me turn it to Hari.
Yeah, in the sense that both Peter and I play at the intersection of multiple worlds. We are constantly looking for innovative ideas. We are working with companies to understand why and how they want to innovate. We're looking at new technologies. We are helping leaders transition. So all of these worlds came together at the project and the startup that Peter and I have co-founded. So curiosity, I guess, is a simple answer, but I think we are also a bit of fun because you never know how these new technologies play out, right? So we want to experiment with it.
So, how do you, how, Hari and Peter, how do you know each other? How did this
Oh,
happen?
Peter actually put out a paper, I think 2, 3 years ago, a report called Platform Professionals. It explores the world of platform strategy, platform business models, and enterprises embarking on the platform journey. And his research showed that there is a different set of capabilities, a different set of talent required, and different set of organization model required actually to enable the transition. So since I operate in the strategy organization space, I came across this research and I knocked on his doors. And since then, we have collaborated on a number of areas, and that's how the partnership built up.
That sounds great. That sounds great. So I also want to understand what is your point of view on the entire NFT as a domain right now? Because when it started, it got a lot of hype. A lot of people got into the bandwagon. People started minting NFT. Bored Ape Yacht Club came into picture. Celebrities started owning NFT, and it was a big buzzword or hype word throughout the year. But recently, it has been through a derail from that. It is slowly declining. People are talking less about it. People claim on the social media, on Twitter and internet, they have lost money, while some say the other story. So, what is your point of view on the current scenario on NFT from where it started? It has a great start, I would say. I think it was the most Googled term in the last year, I believe. But now there is a slight ambiguous feelings of everyone around this. So, what is your point of view on this journey that NFT as a product or NFT as a domain has taken throughout this time, and where do you see it is going maybe in the next 6 months?
Right. So great question. NFTs exploded on the scene really in 2021. There was a lot of excitement around it because I think it offered some new capabilities in that you could take a digital asset and suddenly attribute uniqueness to it, right? And scarcity. So it had some of these really interesting fundamental properties that in the past were very difficult to attribute to digital assets. And there was an explosion of experimental companies that emerged in this space. And some of them, were really interesting and very innovative. And as you know, quite a number of them were rug pulls and scams. So it was a bit of a wild, wild west there. But one of the trends that I've been looking at is kind of this transition from native Web3 companies, like you mentioned, Bored Ape, to brands that are now exploring this opportunity to engage with a new generation, do things that they realize are a kind of a mega trend. And so they're experimenting right now, and it runs the gambit. There are probably more than 200 brands that have tried some kind of NFT project. So it's very difficult to categorize very simply because the range of cases is so broad. And that has to do partly with both people experimenting, but also the range of ways that you can apply NFTs, right? They can be a way to identify, art, all the way to actually there's automobile companies that are using it for tracking maintenance records for a vehicle. So there's just a huge range of applications. So it's very difficult, I think, at this stage to say, hey, what's the state of play? Because it's super diverse.
Got it, got it. Yeah, that's clear. I think maybe they have a really great application in terms of solving for things like a use case of ownership, like who bought the car,
Yeah.
when was the first servicing done. I think putting those things into blockchain really legitimize things, and especially in markets where secondary sales of car is used, I think that is a great utility, or even utility of verifying education or job credential, because people around the world do a lot of fake certification, but an NFT can approve it. But on that point, I am curious on how the mass adaptation is going to be, right? Because again, NFT print minting is expensive, while there are new solution through Polygon or something that is coming up, and there are a few of them already there. Uh, I mean, my point is, when would we see a mass adoption? Is it 5 year down the line? Is it 10 year down the line?
Or
When
more
that
than when,
something will be?
I'm also interested in how. Is it going to be brands first, like the way in terms of computers, brands first started buying computers, and after that it's when we end users started buying it in our houses. So who do you
Yeah.
see pushing NFTs to the markets out there?
I think
I
that's a
think
really difficult question because the applications are so broad. So why don't we focus a little bit about certifying in education and continuous learning, and talk a little bit about MyLearningNFT as an application. It might
Sure.
provide us kind of a concrete way to progress our conversation. So, Hari,
yeah,
do you want
just
to mention,
yeah.
kind of
So
the
let
how
me
our NFT works?
yeah. So I do want to give a quick preamble to the question that is there. If you look at it, the entire frenzy of NFT started with Jack Dorsey selling his first tweet as an NFT, right? Now, what is fascinating in that journey is very early on, I tried to buy an NFT, but I had to have a digital wallet on one of the crypto wallets, essentially. And then that had to link to my bank account, that had to link to 20 other things. And by the way, when I actually get the NFT, that was in a completely different wallet. So mass adoption that you see that has happened over now is there are multiple mainstream integrations that have happened. One obviously is the most obvious, payment systems. And that has been significantly influenced by fintech and gaming as a sector, because you're trying to integrate all the experience into one cohesive space, wallet, all of that, right? So I think, so we will see, I think, increased adoption because the technologies or the underlying interfaces that we use are increasingly going to be mainstream, and that's really what has happened. I think the biggest change that we have seen in this NFT space is really is coming into mainstream. So where normal people can actually click Apple Pay and get an NFT without actually having to understand 20 things about Polygon or Ethereum, right? So I think that's one part of the answer.
Yeah.
And continuing with the, so yeah, Peter.
Well, I was just going to say that Facebook just announced that they have 400,000 users now that have clicked through their Instagram NFT. So, these big companies have large customer
Yeah.
bases.
And it's
so
no different. Yeah. And it's not that different than a Twitter now having, you can use your NFT as a Twitter profile picture, right? So the journey on MyLearningNFT follows a similar path where we want to bring this Web3 layer 2 protocol technology to mass adoption to benefit the executive education, training and development, learning as a concept industry. And Peter actually initiated the idea saying, hey, he was at a conference and he saw this Tamagotchi as an example for what we call as dynamic assets or living assets, right? So soul-bound tokens, which is what we do. And then we said, we did a bit of research and we came across one obvious fact. And the second one was a little more difficult one. The obvious fact was there was a gentleman called Ebbinghaus, a German psychologist who did a lot of research on memory. And he discovered that people forget most of the content in roughly about 2 weeks after they've attended an event, learned something, or experienced something, right? So there is a significant forgetting curve that humans have all the time. It's not just with learning, with anything else. The second thing we know from our experience and having worked in the industry, both Peter and I can vouch for it, is that companies spend enormous amounts of money on training and development or learning, but practically have no way to measure the impact of it on how people learn after a certain event has happened. So we were trying to go after these two problems, situations, issues, and trying to see how Web3 can actually solve it, right? So that is the broad context of it. In terms of how it works, and then I'll pass you to Peter after this, is it's very simple. As you continue to learn after your event, let's say I've graduated from a course today or completed a training program. If I continue to learn in certain areas related to the training program, my NFT appreciates in value or depreciates in value if I don't, right? So if I don't learn every 90 days, which is what our product does right now, the NFT defaults to the next lower level of value and properties, essentially. There are 2-3 things that are extremely important on why this is the future. One is ownership. Typically, learning is owned by companies. The data that is generated out of learning, me attending a learning program, is owned by the company, not by me. But all of the time, companies want to drive ownership of learning on the individuals. We want leaders to own learning. We want leaders to own knowledge. We want leaders to own their own career paths. But everything that we've built so far in Web 2 and everything else transfers that ownership to the company, not to the individual. Right? But Web3 allows us for the individual to own the learning. That's number one. Number two is verifiability, which is, I think, at the heart of blockchain. So when somebody learns, the faculty actually verifies that the learning is valid. And if I've listened to a podcast or read an article, if Peter is my course faculty, Peter would actually verify that I've actually learned something that is the right thing to do from a course perspective. The third thing is analytics, cohort level. So we can actually show you how will cohorts learn, what is their most preferred behavior of learning, what are they learning, which topic are they learning. So that analytics drives curation of learning much better, sharper for business outcomes. So that is a broad construct of what we went at. So let me pass you to Peter.
Yeah. So, one of the things that's important to recognize is that many NFTs are static, right? They don't change their properties. But there are opportunities to use NFTs in a dynamic way, right? And so with learning, what we wanted to capture is that when somebody gets a certificate, and you see it on LinkedIn all the time, right? After people take a training course, they post it. That certificate is static, right? It tells you nothing about what that person did afterwards, after they received it. Some people get excited and inspired by what they learn, and they continue to invest in that learning, right? Others take that course and do nothing with it. And so the static certificate does not record and show what their true knowledge acquisition and maintenance is. And so what we thought about is, and it was inspired by this little game, the Japanese little Tamagotchi guy, which is if you didn't feed it, it died. Right. And so what we're trying to do with the dynamic NFT is to recognize that we need to create incentives for people to maintain their education. Education takes investment, it takes time, it takes effort, right? And as Hari mentioned, we know from the research and is that people forget, it's just a natural case of human our human
Got
experience.
Yeah.
And so companies are investing a lot in what they call the learning curve, right? Getting people up the learning curve, but they're doing very little on the forgetting curve side. And the reality is that education is a rapidly depreciating asset unless you reinvest it. So the whole concept of the MyLearningNFT is a way to capture this post-learning and make sure that you're engaging, and it supports and encourages the individual because nobody wants to see their certificate degrade. And so we've designed the NFT so it's very clear that if you do nothing, it loses both its number of attributes and its coloration. It turns from very bright, exciting to very gray and unexciting. And so that's an incentive mechanism. And also the NFT itself, as we just mentioned, is what they call a soul-bound token.
Okay.
This is not a tradable token,
Yeah.
right? It's really to represent your own education. And as a consequence, there's not this, whole fervor around speculation, very probably low reasons to do fraud and scams around that, because if you steal somebody's NFT, who's going to buy it? It doesn't have value outside of the individual. However, it does have tremendous value, and there's a ton of ways that companies can use a dynamic NFT both to capture data, and then we can talk in more detail about kind of the platform dimensions of how do you encourage the cohort to contribute each other. So for example, if somebody reads something that's super relevant to that learning activity, they can share it with that group and then raise up everybody's learning. So there's lots of interesting ways you can deploy this particular type of NFT.
I'm sorry to interject. So this is a soul-based token. It's not non-tradable. Is this assigned to a cohort or this is assigned to an individual user? One NFT. Like
It
who
has to
owns
be an
it?
individual user because that is the premise of Web3. It cannot be owned by anybody else, right? So even as even if you look, even if it was not a soul-bound token, the NFT will be owned by an individual. There's a private key, and I own it and I protect it. And so the only difference in a soul-bound token is it still belongs to me, but it's just not tradable.
Got it.
The cohort comes into play in the sense that the example I can give is if all 5 of us were in a training program or an education program, when we graduate, we all get our individual MyLearningNFT. But as a cohort, we will be able to see each other's status on learning. From a privacy standpoint, we don't show exactly how you're learning, which only you can see as an individual. But at a high level, I know Peter's NFT is in phase 5 or tier 5 or has got certain points. And I can see Vishal at a different level, you at a different level. So I can see how the cohort is doing at an aggregated level, but the NFT still belongs to me.
Got it. I have some question. Great concept, and I love what you're doing in this space. My first question is, when you're talking about value, is it just the visualization of the NFT, or are you also having some utility attached to it? So like, let's say, I am at a level 5 NFT. Do I get some more cool utility if someone at a level 2?
Sure.
Or how does that work out?
Yeah. So let's give a concrete example. So this year, there's an annual conference at MIT, and it's called the MIT Platform Strategy Summit. So as part of that event, it's, we bring together top thinkers and practitioners in the area of platform strategy. And it's a great experience, and people learn a lot because there's a lot of sharing between the speakers and the attendees. So we issued an NFT associated with that event. So what we're going to do is that people who sustain their NFT continue to engage in the content that was learned during that very intense day, can get a discount on next year's conference if they maintain their NFT at the highest level by May next year, right? But there's other things we can do as well, because there's a cohort of the number of people who attended that conference. We can see who the active learners are now. right? Who are truly engaged, who are sustaining their NFT. I can go to a sponsor and say, hey, if you want to sponsor a really nice dinner, we can invite the top tier people to come. And because a lot of companies are interested in the practitioners, and we're talking about people who run, platform or marketplaces for very, very large companies are the typical attendees. So they're an attractive group to bring together. So I could potentially go and get a third party who come in, who would be interested in meeting these people, learning more about what they're doing, and sponsor a special dinner. So there's tons of ways that you can encourage.
Got it.
Another example is, imagine a publication, right? And that publication is interested in selling to and becoming more visible to a particular group or community. We can do a similar thing. Because it's continuous learning, we could say, hey, why don't you provide your content at a discount to this group? And so it becomes a way for them to engage in that. So the post-learning becomes another marketing opportunity for people who are providing relevant content. So there's tons of ways of building utility around this post-learning, with the fact that it's a dynamic. If it's a static NFT, you don't create that value proposition, right? And the right incentive structures. So NFTs should be thought of also as a way to engage the right incentives. And a lot of people talk about community, right? And what the community's contribution is. This is almost, there are these play to earn, or Steppen has run to earn. There's a lot of these kinds of things. This is almost like an education to earn sort of engagement. We haven't created it completely in that way, but it creates those kinds of incentives.
No, I love the concept. A follow-up just to understand how this works. So let's talk about your example. There was this summit, where you distributed, or you gave My Learning NFTs. Let's say the summit was about blockchain, right? And everybody has an NFT now. They have a year to sustain it, to learn more about blockchain. I could be going to my community college and taking a lesson on blockchain where I earn some credits, or going to a Coursera or an EDX, or to some other college website and learning it, or maybe just buying a book and reading it. How does all of these different sources come back to my NFT and act as a proof that, hey, Aayush has been learning about blockchain through this source?
Perfect. Okay. So first, let's understand that people learn every single day, all the time, right? So let's first get rid of the notion that the only way to learn is attending a training program. So if you look at learning behaviors, when you read a tweet, when you watch something on TV in a passing by in an airport, when a bus is going by with a billboard on it, you're learning all the time. It doesn't matter
or when you are watching a cool Metaverse Simplified podcast.
Correct. Exactly.
Subscribe, guys.
Yeah. So you're learning all the time. So the first important aspect of this learning is a concept called skeuomorphic design. You got to help people capture that learning, because learning is a very intrinsic value-driven activity. Certificate is an extrinsic value. You see it, it's tangible, it's done. But my knowledge is intrinsic to me. So what we tried to do in the design of MyLearningNFT is we have first articulated a set of learning behaviors, or learning actions, as we call it. These could be, and we try to capture all generic ways people learn, reading an article, listening to a podcast. We've even included things like, I have applied a learning in the customer situation. I've had a session with my team to discuss the topic. So, reverse mentoring somebody, in my team, or somebody else coached me on it. So we've included a set of behaviors or actions on typically how people learn. That's part one of it. The part two of it is where it actually gets very interesting, and where the value is unlocked in this entire value chain. When we design a MyLearningNFT, let's take the same case that Peter put. For the MIT Platform Strategy Summit, Peter is a co-chair of the Platform Strategy Summit. He worked with his co-chairs to curate 20 topics on which people need to learn, which we call as knowledge areas. So for example, based on the theme of the conference, based on the sessions on the conference, they have curated 20 knowledge areas that I need to continue to learn after I have attended the summit, right? So it's not that I can't attend a platform strategy summit and start suddenly putting articles on negotiation skills. That doesn't work because then that gets filtered out. So there are certain types of learning behaviors that are system driven that we have captured already that remain consistent across all cohorts. It doesn't matter who, where, how, when. The topics of the knowledge areas are curated with the faculty of the course, in the MIT case, which is Peter and his colleagues. Now, what happens after that is when I learn something, let's say, for example, I learn new governance or legislative trends in regulating platforms, right? And I read an article on how Europe wants to regulate Microsoft and its acquisition of Activision Blizzard. And by the way, that's true in US as well. Now, when I read the article, I'm still learning about governance. So what I do is I go into my MyLearningNFT system and I say, I read an article in government and legislation and regulation around platforms, and I put the link to the article. So what the faculty does is faculty reviews that and says, okay, what Hari read was in direct consonance with the topic that I was supposed to be reading or the knowledge I was supposed to be gaining, and I approve it. When I approve it, I get points and the NFT appreciates in value. There is one interesting thing though. Not all learning behaviors are made equal. When you speak at a conference, the complexity of that is higher. So you get more points than reading an article. When you coach somebody, the impact of coaching is higher. So you get higher points than reading an article, right? So when you actually do a podcast on your own, or when you write an article for a magazine or any of the pieces that, or publish an article on your blog, you get higher points. So the complexity of learning action determines a certain degree of what points you get differentiated. So if Vishal read an article, but I actually spoke at a conference, we both learned something, but I get rewarded higher for that learning behavior, right? So that's the entire construct. That's the background to it. Peter,
This
anything
is
to add?
brilliant. This is amazing.
I want to share something on this. It sounds really great. I see a larger opportunity for the Gen Zs and the new generation who are used to buying digital assets, right? Like people who are in the younger side, like maybe who are in the teenage phase now, they're into metaverse, they're into gaming, they're buying virtual skins and all of that. For them, they relate to an NFT or a digital asset more than me or someone maybe 10 years older than me. While people, while we understand that and we are also trying to, they relate it to more. How are you thinking to approach this to introduce to a school or a university where the end user, that is a very young person, is already relating to the concept that you are creating this? Then they have this entire community. Like in a school, they have a lot of competitive spirit among each other. Like I remember when we were in school, there used to come something called a Pokemon card, and we used to collect those by eating chips and chocolates, and we used to share within our groups of friends that I got the rare one, I got the best one, something like that. I think, how are you thinking to bring this entire great stuff that you have built to this new generation who are already used to having such digital collectible, and they also have this thing around community and mutual competitiveness, and how do you think to approach this, which I see as a great opportunity?
I'll leave that question to Peter, but I do want to add one comment before that. I
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
necessarily believe that adoption of digital technologies that we see is necessarily generation based. I've spent the last 5 years looking at who, for example, who uses Swiggy in India? What generation uses it the most?
The
Right. So
millennials, I would say.
yeah, maybe we don't know, but because everybody's ordering food regardless of age. So the concept of what digital has done is that the brilliant behavior driven interfaces have bridged their generation gaps. Now, will an NFT be used by an 80-year-old person? It depends on the utility of the NFT. But my view is if it's brilliantly designed to fit the purpose, it will. And I read an article recently on the applications of Metaverse for Alzheimer's early stage diagnosis and people to use, because it helps them. It's like they do activities all the time right now. By the way, they're doing very rudimentary. I don't know if you know the Nokia phone snake game, right? So you respond left, right. So there are exercises like that for patients today, but things like Metaverse can be a multi-sensory patient care, chronic care experience by itself. So I don't think it is a generation-driven thing. It's a fit-for-purpose-driven thing. But Peter is the foresight person. Let me pass it to Peter.
Yeah. No, before
So
that, I
I've
agree
been,
with that. I agree with that. I think my point on generation is basically when Swiggy came to India, the millennials were the first adopter. Like I ordered food online 3 years before my father started using that app. So my point is like, who are the early adopters that in that way? I'm not
Sure.
saying no one will, but that is how I wanted to reframe my question maybe.
Yeah, but here is a fun thing.
so
Older people get lazier faster than younger people. So once I may adopt it slower, but once I adopt it, I'll be a much bigger user than a younger person, right? So
That's true. I'll give you an anecdote. It took me like 2 or 3 years from to make my mom started using Big Basket, which is the online grocery app in India. It took me 3 years to convince her that this really works, and now she has stopped going out. So I agree. Once they adopt it, they will never go out of it.
Peter?
so I've been looking at NFTs applied by companies in the auto sector, so the automotive sector. And there's some really, really interesting use cases. So the most recent one I came across was Toyota Lexus. They have a test track in California. And so you can go to that test track and join their performance driving school, right? And I can imagine maybe there are a few young people, but most of the people that go to these performance driving schools tend to be in their 30s, 40s, or even 50s, right? And if you take this course, you get issued an NFT as part of your certificate, right? And it's a very nice NFT, and it has a video embedded in it of your racing around the track. So they capture the moment in that and they issue it as an NFT. Now, the interesting thing is that they don't issue it as a dynamic NFT. Imagine if they had issued it as a dynamic that, okay, you did this performance test drive, but most companies want customers to come back again and again and again. Imagine if they had issued a dynamic NFT instead that, they needed to sustain by re-engaging with Lexus to do some things, to learn more about the car, or maybe reward them for going into a Lexus Metaverse environment. There's lots of ways that brands can use these kinds of techniques in order to engage them, reward them, but sustain that. That's the thing that I think I haven't seen brands do well yet, which is sustain the engagement. I think the one project that stands out is obviously Nike Artifact, in that they've built a community.
Yeah.
You have some really cool applications where they're now embedding NFC chips into the clothing so that when you have a filter, an AR filter, it shows this clothing actually sprouting digital attributes. In this case, they have wings. So
Yeah, I think
those
they have
are
already
really
launched it.
interesting use cases of taking an NFT, rewarding the community that bought into that NFT and sustaining it with really interesting engagement. So I think, to me, that's where the world is going. It's about engagement, ownership, and then rewards and incentives, because your customers also may be interested, because they're fans, they may be wanting to do things to support that. So how do they get rewarded for that? And so the NFTs become a really interesting vehicle, and they're, often the case, they're tradable. So if somebody puts a lot of effort into that NFT, it becomes more valuable, and then maybe they get rewarded with an in real life experience. So another example is, Volkswagen in Brazil. they did an NFT, and the reward for that NFT was to go to visit the Volkswagen factory and do a tour of the actual factory. So there's lots of ways that brands can leverage these technologies to engage people. And it could be young people as early adopters, but trust me, there are people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s that want great experiences as well.
I still consider 30 as young, guys, just saying.
One other point I want to add to Peter is one of the interesting dimensions of this entire community-based, utility-based, reward-based, engagement-based Web3 trend is that you can actually design engagement with consumers and customers N=1. For a long time, companies have tried to hyper-customize solutions and experiences for individual consumers. But end of the day, when you get to scale, it becomes impossible to do it exactly the way you want to do it. So this hyper customization or hyper localization has been holy grail for all kinds of brands. Now, what Web3 will allow is because of if you combine my demographics, if you combine my online behavior of how I interact with the brand, and then if you combine it with what I would like to prefer to do in my life, this data is much more easily uniquely identifiable in a utility NFT or a dynamic NFT. So you could potentially cater experiences or design experiences for 1 billion users where each one user is uniquely different from another in theory, right? So it's a whole new level of complexity, but it's a whole new level of design as well. Peter?
Right. And the reality is they know now that 90% of people who buy a car do some research online before they make that purchase. So we know they're going online, but that experience isn't very interesting. So I think the most advanced in this case, I've been looking at the auto sector, but it's true of many other sectors, is that how do you capture their interest? How do you make it exciting for them? Going to a static web page with lots of products listed is not very interesting. So basically Web3 allows for you to turn that 2D experience into a 3D experience, right? And then the NFTs offer really interesting incentives and reward structures. So really, I think the focus for the next 2 or 3 years is how do you design this really well so it achieves the goals that the brands are after? And that to me is really the exciting space.
So going back to MyLearningNFT, just trying to act as a devil's advocate here. I see, okay, somebody learns something, there's a professor or somebody else, an administrator who verifies that whatever this person has learned is relevant. Now the NFT appreciates. This could have been a point system or a level system in a Web2 interface where again you have an administrator and let's say somebody's getting a score between 0 to 1000, 10,000, whatever, and that number appreciates. For the same concept, was blockchain or usage of NFT really required? Users could have been given their IDs.
We get asked by companies all the time as to how is this, I don't know if you heard the word LXPs, learning experience platforms. They try to gamify a lot of learning solutions, and you have a large number of gamification plugins available, platforms available, etc. I will go back and emphasize on the word ownership because I think that is a starting point of what differentiates this entire thing. When I learn with the company is controlling how I learn, the company is defining how I learn, the company is controlling data of my learning. With MyLearningNFT, the company actually does not have access to my individual learning data unless I choose to share with the company. So what it does, conversely, it has to build an extremely high environment of employee engagement and trust for the Web3 application to work in that context. Because what you're trying to tell leaders and everybody in the company is you should be learning for your own benefit. It's not about the company. So therefore, what you do as your action belongs to you. We will reward it for sure, but the starting point is you, the end point is you. That's number one. I think that's really, that ownership is a huge differentiator and people don't understand it. And it's like an oxymoron of sorts right now. I have not seen a single company say that employees don't own their careers. But all of the systems and the technologies are conversely designed to do exactly opposite of that.
Yeah, true.
So Web3 actually negates that principle. And I think it's a very difficult concept for companies to grapple because companies inherently are high control freaks, if you may, right? So they're not used to this word called trust is, I come from an HR background. So I say two things. There are two big lies that companies say all the time. Number one, employees are your biggest assets, right? Every company, have you ever found a company that doesn't say it, but you have terrific companies and you're really horrible companies to work for? Number two is you own your life, which is not true because they're determining the very rigid parameters in which you determine your professional life with the company. What Web3 does is trying to break the shackles and decentralize all of it, which is inherently uncomfortable for a company because guess what? I can form a union using blockchain and my company will not be able to track it.
That's a brilliant use
I think
case.
the word decentralization has also made a lot of people unhappy and uncomfortable because the potential the word and the concept itself has.
But
Also,
but also one of the reasons that companies underinvest in education and helping their employees learn skills is they're afraid those people are going to leave, right? So if you have an NFT and the company, we actually have a space where companies can put their brand logo, right? So that they get some credit for having invested in that person. Right. So, I think we acknowledge and we celebrate companies that do invest in their employees. And so the question is, how do you get credit for that if that person moves? And we know that people are moving multiple times over their career to different companies. And so if the NFT shows that, yeah, I got my certificate here, I worked for GE for quite a number of years. And they invested heavily in my executive training. I went to quite a number of executive training programs. If I had had dynamic NFTs associated that with the GE brand, that would be up on my LinkedIn profile. Right now, they're not getting any brand recognition for those investments. So I think it goes both ways. You can decentralize and there's benefits for the individual, but we also have to think about the companies as well because they're the ones actually paying the bill often for these trainings, and we
so
want to make sure that they get rewarded for that.
a follow-up question. Again, let's take an example. For example, a company XYZ has 100 employees. They decide that for their learning and training programs, they want My Learning NFT. Now they subscribe or buy 100 NFTs. I'm not sure of the exact terminology that you use. So let's say Vishal is one of the employees, and after 6 months, he decides to leave the company. Now that, because it's an SBT, uh, will that NFT still be with Vishal when he goes to a different company? And now that he's gone to a different company, who pays for it?
So number one, the NFT was never with your company in first place. It was always with the employee, right? It only has changed its cohort affiliation of sorts in a sense. But Vishal the NFT, My Learning NFT always was with Vishal, will always remain with Vishal, number one. The NFT duration, what we have done in our pilot so far and what we are beginning to learn as well is we started with an assumption that people should learn ideally for 3 years based on the complexity of the topic and everything else. So we thought the post-course learning should be for a period of 3 years. That's where we started the original concept and design from. Then we went on to, as we evolved this and as we started piloting it, we went to saying, okay, why don't we allow companies the choice between 1, 2, and 3 years, right? So one course can be for 3 years post-learning, one course can be 1 year, and companies can decide that. But the evolution of a learning continued. Then we came to a point where we felt MyLearningNFT could be applied, as in the case of MIT Platform Strategy Summit, because conferences will benefit to engage participants to come back next year. But by the way, also significantly enhance the knowledge quotient of people coming into the conference through MyLearningNFT. Then we went to even possibility of 6 months. So finally, where we are today is we landed up at a period of 1 year after the course as a standard for everybody to use, which we think is an optimum time for people to learn to increase the stickiness of the subject, right? So
So after 1 year, the NFT
Then it
expires.
becomes static
static, yeah.
Okay, got it.
So whatever your
based on
last
what
phase of
points you
learning,
have. So it could become static at the lowest level because they made no investment in their education, or it can become static at the highest level. So that creates an incentive for people to sustain, because nobody wants to have a low level, not very attractive looking NFT. So that creates these incentives to continue to learn and engage. And so there's lots of different ways for funding this. You mentioned obviously employers. And in fact, the reality is these days, people are attracted to a company, obviously for a salary, interesting work. They also expect a company to help them advance their careers. So there's a lot of pressure on companies to do training programs, right? And in fact, it's called education as a benefit. So it becomes part of your benefit package, right? And you're more likely to go to a company that has a better training package. And in fact, this has become an issue for many companies, is that they need to compete now on education as a criteria for engaging the best employees. So we believe that the dynamic NFT is another way to actually improve the rate of return on those investments in education, both for the employee as well as the company that's providing the funding for it.
So to all our CEOs, employees, VP directors, HRs watching this podcast, if you think you really need to uh, not revolutionize, but increase your returns on learning and trainings, please contact Peter and Hari and get My Learning NFTs to your company and ride the Web3 wave in a very positive manner. So Hari,
the way we've started to think about it is that education is a rapidly depreciating asset. And this kind of approach with My Learning NFT can help reduce the rapid depreciation of those assets and get the kind of behavior that we want from employees, which is to make them excited and continuous learners, and that information is captured so that we understand. So for example, if you had a group of 50 people that took a course, you see that 25% of them, are very active learners. They keep their NFT at the highest level, but 25% aren't doing very much. That's valuable information. A company should know that so that they can do interventions. It's not just about rewarding the top people. It's also about to understand, why aren't these other people engaged and excited? Was the course not appropriate? Were the instructors not as good as they should have been? I mean, there's a bunch of reasons why people aren't performing in the way that would benefit them and the company.
Yeah. No, I think this is a brilliant concept. So, Peter and Hari, thank you so much for joining us today. I think both me and Vishal, we are pretty amazed by the concept of My Learning NFTs. So, folks,
Yeah.
we have the website and the LinkedIn links for Hari and Peter here below. Check them out, and do subscribe
And,
us.
and
Thank you
again, once
both.
again, thank you
Have a
so
great
much
weekend.
for coming up with this great concept. I personally loved it, and I hope it goes well.